My identity is inextricably linked with the death of my friend, and there's nothing I can do about that. I had nothing to do with it, and yet, when the world hears my name, they associate me with a murderer.
Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast that navigates life's toughest moments with the people who've lived them, learned from them and come back stronger. I'm Andy Coulson, and if you've been through a crisis or if you just want to be better prepared for life's inevitable difficulties, these conversations are all about providing those useful, practical lessons that will help you survive, rebuild and thrive again.
I am who I am today because of what I went through.
Today's guest is someone who you may well have an opinion on. Amanda Knox became headline news at just 20 years old in one of the world's most high-profile and protracted criminal cases, a case that provoked and to a very damaging extent for her fixed so many of those opinions around the world. Amanda's story is and remains in many ways beyond belief.
I came into existence in the public mind in a very specific light, and with a very specific role as the villain.
In 2007, Amanda was a student from Seattle, spending a year abroad in Perugia. Just weeks into her stay, her British flatmate, Meredith Kercher, was brutally murdered in the home that they shared. Amanda and her then boyfriend are swiftly arrested, jailed and accused of the killing, despite a shocking lack of physical evidence linking them to the crime. What followed was a painful and very long emotional nightmare. Along the way, Amanda became, as she puts it, patient zero of social media shaming and cancellation. In 2009, after a trial heavily influenced by a lurid narrative and legal misconduct, Amanda was convicted of murder and sentenced to 26 years in an Italian prison. She served 4 years behind bars before her conviction was overturned on appeal in 2011, allowing her to return to the United States. But her ordeal didn't end there.
The messaging that I received was, shut up and disappear, you psychopath, you narcissist. And even those who did believe in my innocence sort of trapped me in this sort of true crime box.
The case was retried twice more, with a reinstatement of her conviction in 2014 and finally a definitive acquittal by Italy's highest court in 2015. That ruling acknowledged not only her innocence but the gross mishandling of the investigation and prosecution. And in the midst of all this, in 2008, a third person, Rudy Giuliani, was arrested. The DNA evidence linking him to the murder was definitive, and in 2009 he was convicted of Meredith's murder in a separate fast-track trial. He served 13 years and was released in 2021.
The day that Rudy Giuliani broke into our house and raped and murdered Meredith, all of our lives were destroyed. Mine too.
Throughout this extraordinary, as I say, saga, with its brutal public scrutiny, personal loss and profound injustice, Amanda Knox demonstrated something quite remarkable. Stoicism in the face of chaos, resilience in the face of vilification, and perhaps most impressively, a refusal to be solely defined by her experiences. Today, Amanda is a writer, journalist, speaker, an advocate for criminal justice reform. She's become an articulate and passionate voice on the issues of wrongful conviction, trial by social media, and the psychological cost of public shaming. But crucially, she speaks not just from a place of outrage, but of insight, empathy, and of wisdom.
There was a longer road of discovering my sense of purpose and my identity in the free world than I did when I was wrongly imprisoned.
Amanda's new book, Free, My Search for Meaning, tells the story of how, through that hard-earned wisdom and insight, she has found peace and purpose from the wreckage of trauma and scandal. So this is a conversation not about guilt or innocence, because that's settled. It's about identity, justice, and how to react when the world gets your story wrong. It's about reclaiming your own voice in the loudest, most violent of storms. A story of how to survive a nightmare, really, that most of us could never imagine.
This story is a living, breathing part of me because I was fortunate enough to survive it. And what happened to Meredith and what happened to me matters.
Crisis. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Your book is quite a thing. I've used the word extraordinary. I've used the word extraordinary twice. I suspect I'm going to use it several more times. It's packed with content, with insights and guidance that are transferable, really, for anyone dealing with life's difficulties. In fact, you say in the book that your circumstances are extraordinary, but the challenges that you faced are universal. That was a significant motivation for you in writing this book?
Yeah. As you may know, I wrote a memoir back in 2013 called Waiting to Be Heard, which was my attempt at setting the record straight of this very, like you described in your introduction, this lurid narrative that had taken over the case, that had completely overwhelmed the seeking of truth of what happened to my roommate and just blew way out of proportion. And coming out of prison, I felt a deep urgency to just set the record straight and give and add my one voice to the voices of so many people who were authoring my experience. But it wasn't really my story. It was the story of other people who made drastic decisions that had enormous consequences for innocent people, one of which was me, one of which was my roommate, one of which was my co-defendant, one of which was my boss. And so it felt like I absolutely needed to write that memoir, but it wasn't really my story because it was a bad thing that happened to me. And it was an extraordinary bad thing that happened to me. It was something that wasn't really relatable to a lot of people. And then I get out of prison and and then I'm definitively acquitted and I'm technically free. But this freedom was an idea that I meditated on and I had so much hope for. And then when I found the technical freedomness in my grasp, I realized that it was very elusive because I was still trapped within a narrative. I was still trapped within the stigma of an accusation. And I was trapped in having experienced this horrific tragedy that had changed the world around me and also changed me myself. At first, I felt I was very ostracized from the rest of humanity and that what I was experiencing was very unique to me and there wasn't a path forward. But slowly over the course of meeting other people and also making this decision to reach out to my prosecutor, I realized that what I was doing was what anyone does in the wake of trauma. And I felt like it was really important for not just for me to feel seen, but my biggest hope coming out of this book and people reading this book is that people will feel seen having read it. And I think one of the most extraordinary things that I feel signals to me that my intent was a success is that I translated the entire book into Italian prior to it being released in public and shared it with my prosecutor. And his response was fascinating. He said that, of course, he disagrees with certain ways that I interpreted the facts of the case and all of that, but ultimately, he had never felt more seen from what I had written, which is fascinating because he himself saw himself in me. And I think that really shows like how really truly universal what I've attempted to write is.
It's the ultimate demonstration of the universality of it. And
yeah, if my own biggest adversary can feel seen, like that's a success.
But also of your generosity. I mean, you talked about the impact of this for other people. What about for you? Do you feel closer to freedom as a result of writing this book? And now sitting on podcasts like this talking about it?
Coming out of my meeting with my prosecutor, that was when I truly felt free for the first time in my entire adult life. I went over there and I sat down with him and I had a 3-hour conversation with him where I stood up for myself and at the same time showed him compassion and understanding and empathy. And at the end of that all, I realized that, I had spent 10 years of my life more feeling like my well-being and the the status of my life really hinged upon this man, this powerful man who had such an impact on my life. And I realized that it was entirely switched, that I was the one who was unstoppable and empowered and informed. And he was leaning on me for a sense of absolution and well-being that I was not expecting. And so coming out of that really social experiment of mine,
Mm.
um, I realized that I had a story to tell because I had proven to myself that I was more than the worst thing that ever happened to me. And I think that that is the great challenge of these big, overwhelming traumas that happen to us, is it feels like they take over our life and our whole identity is consumed by this narrative or this tragedy and the consequences of it, and the fact that you know it doesn't just go away. Like I've had many people, well-meaning people who care about me, say things to me like, why don't you just move on, like stop thinking about it, stop talking about it, like it's in the past, let the past be in the past. And I like to point out that that is not how grief works. That's not how our experiences work. On the one hand, yes, we start anew every single morning and our life is endlessly full of possibility, but we are informed by what happened to us. And I think that what you want to do is be informed and empowered by what happened to you and not defined and limited by what happened to you. And I think that was my big challenge that I posed myself over the course of this book. And one of my big goals in writing this book as well was showing how I failed to do that for so long.
Yes.
Because it's, again, I think one of the really universal things about trauma is that once that rug has been pulled out from underneath you and everything you thought you could count on in the world is taken away, there's this feeling of falling, of grasping, of lashing out and trying to find something that you feel like you can lean on or that you can control. And it leads a lot of people, myself included, to make devastating mistakes that could have made your life even worse after the worst had already happened.
Yeah.
And so I think I felt it was really important for me to be really open about that so that people didn't feel shame for also having had that experience of like grasping and trying to make sense of the world and failing along the way to
Yeah.
arriving at a sense of success.
I'm keen to talk more about that. So
Mm.
what you said there, sort of among other things, points to forgiveness. It points to control. I know you're a fan of the Stoics, so we'll talk about that.
Mm.
Control being, sort of a fundamental part of, it seems, your sort of operating system now. But there's
Mm.
also gratitude, because you write in the book that you, I'll quote you here: "I wouldn't wish my wrongful conviction on anyone, but nor would I trade it for the world."
Mm. It's true.
So
Yeah.
just explain that for us.
And there's so many layers to the gratitude, right? So this is one element of the gratitude, right? I am who I am today because of what I went through. And there's this great Stoic saying by Seneca that where he says, I basically paraphrasing, I have pity for you if you have never gone through misfortune because you do not know what you are capable of. And so I know as a result of having gone through this experience, both how my greatest weaknesses and my greatest strengths. I know myself in a way that I would not have otherwise been able to know myself. And for that, I am grateful. Another way that I'm grateful is that I now know ways that the world works that I wouldn't have otherwise known. And now I feel like not just that I've had a naive veil taken off of my eyes, but that because of that, I now feel like I can be a more effective agent in the world because I just see it more clearly and I understand how the sausage gets made. And so I know how to interact with those forces. And I'm not going to waste time or energy pursuing a course of action that's not actually going to address the core issue or the mechanisms that are in place. So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful to be alive today because, if I had not met my at the time boyfriend and then eventually co-defendant Raffaele Sollecito 5 days before this crime occurred, I would have been home when this person broke into our house. And I might have been raped and murdered too. So the very fact that I'm alive today to tell the tale, that I survived my own study abroad, is a result of some fluke luck and the fact that I spent 4 years in prison instead of 40. I know people who have spent longer in prison as an innocent person than I have been alive. The fact that I get to have a family and have children when so many women who are wrongly convicted come out and it's too late and they lost that opportunity. There's so many things that I have that at one point in my life I thought I had lost. Um, and just the experience of gratitude is kind of overwhelming. It's not something that I have to remind myself of when I'm feeling down. It's very present in my life. And that's another reason to feel grateful that I just have the kind of disposition that makes feeling gratitude for what I have in my life easy for me. That is not necessarily easy for other people.
Yeah.
And so the many, many ways that I'm experience gratitude helps me as I navigate those negative emotions that continue to arise as a result of my experience, which include, feelings like rage. Rage was a very new emotion for me. Prior to this horrible thing happening in my life, really nothing bad had ever happened to me. I had a loving family. I did well in school. I did well in sports. Literally, like nothing bad had ever happened to me. And then something very, very, very bad happened to me. And I lived in prison sort of numb and dissociated a lot of the time. And so I felt sadness in prison, but I didn't feel rage. And it wasn't until I was released back into the world of freedom, again, like in quotes, freedom, that I experienced, 4 years worth of bottled up rage, righteous, like indignation and I had to make sense of that. And that was really hard.
Because that's rage, and I suspect also it's sort of, twin brother bitterness.
Yeah.
How did you find your way towards a sort of a place where you can manage both those things? I'm guessing that they haven't gone, by the way. I'm guessing that they haven't disappeared from your life entirely.
No, yeah. I think that in the same way that grief never disappears entirely, like it's still. I remember somebody saying to me, my greatest wish for you is that when you look back on all of this, you feel nothing, because then you will know that you are truly over it. Like you don't experience any kind, like it doesn't trigger for you any kind of emotion. And I thought that was a really interesting wish for me, because that feels I just can't even imagine what that would feel like. Like I feel a
Feels
lot of
dangerously close to
very.
denial, doesn't it, as well?
I mean,
Potentially.
maybe
Could take you down that road. But a lot of
yeah,
people talk
I don't.
about the usefulness of denial, right? I'm sure you've had periods where
Sure.
denial's
Yeah.
been incredibly, from a practical, maybe
Well,
strategic point of view, been really helpful.
well, yeah. I mean, I talk about that in the book a little bit, where I describe how the first 2 years of my imprisonment, my family and I were telling each other a story. And that story was, you're living somebody else's life by mistake. This is not your life. We are in a dark tunnel and there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And for us, that that was the verdict. We were waiting for the adults to all just arrive in the room and make the right decision based upon truth. And that didn't happen. That I was sentenced to 26 years in prison and found guilty of a crime that I didn't commit. And that was when I had my first epiphany, which was really that shattering of that denial that I had been living in, that no, 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 this really is my life. This is it. There is no other life I should be living. And I think, again, one another thing to be really grateful for, because I think bitterness arrives is a natural consequence of feeling really grasping and dwelling on the fact that your life is not the life you should be living, and really hanging on to that idea that there's some other life out there that you should be living.
Mm.
And I think that a weird, bitter, sweet um, consequence of the starkness of my reality was that there was no illusion for me that any other life was tangible or within reach.
How did you
Right? I
get
think
to
one.
that point, Amanda? You're a very young woman at this stage whose life has been turned inside out, who has, as you just explained, had no real experience of difficulty or of crisis, and whose life, in the most extraordinary, again that word, fashion, unravelled, sitting in a prison cell in Italy, convicted of murder, facing decades in prison. How did you get to that epiphany then? Because that, what you've described is, again, the sort of another central lesson of Stoicism. Your life was exactly what it was presenting itself to be, and nothing
Mm,
else. And you had to confront that. How on earth did you manage that, to reach that insight?
well, again, what I'm trying to say is that it was as simple as looking at the door. Here's a door made of bars with no handle that I can't open. I can't. That is my life. I am sitting in a room surrounded by bars with very few possessions and very few opportunities. And that's it. Like that's it. It's the door that I can't open. And I can either lay in my bed and stare at a door that I cannot open, or I can look around me and ask myself, what can I do? And one of those things, by the way, is imagine not existing at all. So, again, 22 years old, sitting in that cell, one of the things that I imagined was ending it all. And then I chose not to. And it was in the choosing not to that I realized that the responsibility of me living my life and making it worth living was mine, because I was choosing to live it. I didn't have to. And so it didn't make sense for me to rail against the injustice committed to me by others when ultimately it was me who was choosing to live this life. And so once I had gotten, and this is again goes back to like, how do I be an effective agent in my life? How do I see my world clearly so that I can work, I can make an impact for myself and others? Well, first of all, it requires letting go and accepting the reality that is. So once I stopped thinking about how I didn't belong in prison, and I stopped thinking about how my real life was outside beyond these walls, I started looking around me and noticing that, yes, I was very tragically an innocent person in this prison that I didn't belong in, But in comparison to other people, guilty people who I was in prison with, I was actually extremely fortunate because I had a loving family. I had an education. I had my health. I had my teeth. I could read and write. I eventually learned how to speak Italian so I could speak fluently. And instead of living as a competitor for the scarce resources that this prison had available to each one of us. And again, scarce because punitive, it was punitively scarce. I asked myself, well, what can I give to this environment? And I was able to give a lot, as it turned out. And careful what you wish for in life. Like, I set out to go to Italy so that I could become a translator. And I became the unofficial translator in prison because there was no official translator for anyone who didn't speak Italian. And I read and wrote people's letters for them, and I helped them look through their court documents because I could read and write, and a lot of the people around me couldn't. So it was weirdly easier in prison
Meaningful?
to be meaningful, to have a sense of purpose than it was, ironically, when I got out. And so again, like, I spend some time in the book talking about prison and the relationships that I established with people and the work that I set out to do once I had sort of given up this idea that I belonged somewhere else. And then I talk about getting out and how it felt like there was no place for me and there was no path for me. And the messaging that I received was, shut up and disappear, you psychopath, you narcissist. And even those who did believe in my innocence sort of trapped me in this sort of true crime box. And I felt like I had to live in a veil of mourning for the rest of my life. And I was constantly being compared to my dead roommate. And there didn't seem like there was a path forward for me or a place for me. And I had to, there was a longer road of discovering my sense of purpose and my identity in the free world than I did when I was wrongly imprisoned.
There are many things that people just sort of bypassed with you. One of them is definitely your own grief. Grief for what happened to you, but grief for what happened to Meredith. She was your roommate. She was your friend, and you lost her. And regardless of what came after, the appalling sort of sequence of events, that would have been enough for most girls of that age, most anyone of that age, to have endured and then to have to live with for the rest of their lives. It would be enough for anyone to contend with throughout their lives.
Thank you for saying that. A lot of people don't really acknowledge that with me. That this was a person I knew who was kind to me, who I had pizza with and who I went dancing with and baked cookies with. And she was a very, very lovely person. And my memories of spending time with this person, I did not get to spend that much time with her. It was, 4 or 5 weeks that we knew each other. We went shopping together. Like, we're two young people at this beautiful moment in our lives. And then I'll never forget the first time I was inadvertently shown her body, because when I came home and discovered the crime scene, I did not discover her body. I discovered that my house had been broken into. And so I had my boyfriend call the police. I didn't actually know how to call the police in Italy, so I had my boyfriend call the police for me. And in the meantime, I was trying desperately to get a hold of my roommates. Meredith was just one of 3 roommates, and 2 of my roommates were not picking up their phones, both Meredith and Laura. And the only person I got through to was Filomena. And so Filomena and I are trying to get a hold of our other 2 roommates. We're not able to. And then in the midst of all of that, the police arrive. They break in Meredith's store and discover her body, and I never saw it. So there's a lot of it for me in those early days was just trying to piece together what all these Italian speakers were saying very quickly and very loudly and talking over each other and trying to make sense of it and trying to understand what had happened. But like even months and months later, after I knew that Meredith had been murdered and it was brutal and she had been stabbed to death and likely raped and all of that, I had never actually seen it. It was almost like this abstract idea. And it was one day that my attorneys came in and they wanted to ask me about something that was found at the crime scene. I think some object, I don't know. And so they were flipping through crime scene, photos, and they had this like stack of crime scene photos and looking for this object. I don't know, something that was found on the floor, whatever. And they happened to flip to a page that showed Meredith laying there, her body, like surrounded by blood, like a horrible gash in her neck. And I had never seen that before. And I flipped out. I was crying hysterically. I went into a panic attack. My attorneys had to uh, stopped the meeting, and the guard came and grabbed me and brought me back to my cell. And on the way back to my cell, I'm just like, hyperventilating and crying. And she's like, what is going on? What happened? And I just said, they showed me her body. They showed me her body. And they were like, you've seen it before. What are you freaking out about? And just like that, those moments where it's like in their mind, they think I'm a murderer. And so they think that I'm not traumatized from having just witnessed what happened to my friend. But so like I'm not given, as a young person whose friend was murdered, the normal sort of support
Protections.
and
Yeah.
and protections that that you would provide someone else. And so I had to sit there in court and listen to them talk about what was found in her digestive tract and like dissecting her like an animal. And it was just horrific. And so there's a chapter in my book about trying to go back, trying to push all of those horrible, horrible, visceral and graphic images and memories aside so that I can go back to the memory of this person that I knew and grieve for her. And one of the reasons that I really felt drawn to going back to Italy was just for that reason, was for the opportunity to grieve her and also grieve myself, grieve the girl who nothing bad had ever happened to, who never got to come home.
Yes. You write very movingly about Meredith, about your relationship, and about how your identities, kind of remain so entwined. I mean, it's well documented, Amanda, that Meredith's family and their family lawyer have been critical of you. You dedicate your book to her, among others, and you say this to Meredith, rest in peace, whose legacy I will never stop honouring, and her family, because I still hope we can share our grief one day. So that is your hope. That remains your hope.
Yeah, it's a really difficult conundrum that I'm in, and it's been the most difficult part of really figuring out myself and my place in the world and my purpose is realizing that my identity is inextricably linked with the death of my friend. And there's nothing I can do about that. I had nothing to do with it. And yet, when the world hears my name, they associate me with a murderer. And when Meredith's family thinks of me, they do not remember me as one of Meredith's roommates. They remember me as the girl accused of murdering their loved one. And whether or not they have come to accept my innocence or not at this point, what remains a legitimate grievance on their part is that the truth of what happened to Meredith got lost in the scandal and in that lurid narrative that casts so much doubt in their minds about what really happened. And I I see them, and especially, I mean, more than I see them, I see their attorney blaming me for that outcome. And interestingly, not blaming the actual murderer
Mm.
for that outcome and not
Mm.
blaming the prosecutor for that outcome,
Mm.
both of whom have also written books about the case and given interviews and public talks. So I do think it's very noteworthy that the attorney for Meredith's family has really set in his sights me and no one else who is responsible for that outcome. Um, and I just know that it's not fair. I know that it's short-sighted, but I also understand it. At least I understand it from the family's perspective, not from their attorneys, but from the family's perspective, whether it's valid or not. When they think of me, they think of the worst thing that ever happened to them.
Yes.
I don't push, I've not like pursued aggressively a relationship with them because I know that they have to confront a lot of trauma just to even think about me, much less have a relationship with me or communicate with me or meet with me. So I try to be very sensitive to that. At the same time, though, the day that Rudy Gay broke into our house and raped and murdered Meredith, all of our lives were destroyed. Mine too. And we have a lot more in common than I think they realize. And I blame the prosecution and the media, and especially their attorney, who I think has been extremely irresponsible, um, for making it impossible for that kind of connection to happen.
The analysis of people who seek to criticize you for your approach is that set aside innocence and guilt in their whatever kind of warped things are going on in their minds as to what the actual truth is about the case, which seems clear, if I can put it that way. It's this criticism that by owning your own story, you are keeping the pain alive. That's the basic criticism, isn't it? And is that what you mean? Is that what you mean when you use the word conundrum? Do you understand that? You feel that a bit yourself?
Yeah.
You have days when you wonder, actually, am I doing that?
Yeah, sure. I wonder if, both for my sake and for theirs, would it be better just to, go about life and act like the bad thing didn't happen? Um, and there have certainly been times in my life where I wanted to do that. Like I just wanted to be an anonymous college student again, and I just wanted to, disappear into the German countryside and make hats, like, but what I discovered is that one, this story is a living, breathing part of me because I was fortunate enough to survive it. And two, what happened to Meredith and what happened to me matters. It is history, and it is a history that reveals so much of about our institutions that need addressing. Um, I do not think that this case would have gone awry and the truth of what had happened to Meredith would have been lost had the media been more responsible and had the prosecution and the detectives been held accountable or been more properly trained from the beginning to do their jobs properly. And so I think that it is always valuable and in the public interest to learn from history. And what happened to Meredith and what happened to me are not just unique, random circumstances. This kind of thing happens to young women. So, what happened to Meredith happens to young women around the world every day. A young woman is sexually assaulted and murdered by a man. And we need it, we need to learn from that, and we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And to do that, we need to remember and go and try to find the truth of what happened and hold people accountable. And on the flip side of that, what happened to me, wrongly convicted, coerced into a false confession, my human rights violated. This is something that happens around the world all the time as well, with shocking regularity. Just coming home to the US, I have encountered hundreds and hundreds of other wrongly convicted people who whose experiences are and backgrounds are very different than mine, but ultimately whose wrongful convictions share a very like systematic set of things that went wrong, that we if we look at all of our stories together and put all of that information together, it gives us a guidebook, a literal like common sense criminal justice reform practices that would protect innocent people and actually hold the actual murderers accountable for their crimes. So to
Yes.
would do justice the way that we want them done. So I have to weigh you know, there is personal pain that is brought up whenever I tell my story. And there's also the value of sharing the story and trying to get the truth out there and trying to change systems so that these kinds of things don't happen again.
Yeah.
And I always, always, always have found that there is more value in acknowledging and sharing our histories than in hiding them in the shadows.
I think what we should say here, I sort of ask the question about, the pain that talking in the way that you do and writing the way that you do, the way that's created pain for others, but of course that's pain for you too. In doing this,
Yeah.
I don't know, how do you feel right now, sat here on a sofa, your kids waiting for you, choosing to spend an hour of your life, in my company, opening this up again, opening the window to anxiety one imagines, right? I don't know. Tell me, am I right? I mean, you've talked about this story, a fair number of times now. But how does it feel?
I am still deeply affected by this experience in my life and the ongoing consequences of this experience in my life.
Mm.
I'm still fighting a wrongful conviction in Italy for a lesser crime. And whenever I tell my story, I break my own heart.
You're visibly emotional. You have been on a number of occasions already in this conversation. For those who are watching, most people will be listening. But that's every time. Does that happen? Do you feel it's raw?
It's very raw. It's still a very raw nerve for me. It's a wound that is still healing, and I have found that it is healing. It is medicine for me to go there, though, because otherwise it remains this nebulous dread
Mm.
within me. And in the act of articulating it, I am putting a light on it so that I can see the pain and the wound clearly. And it is not a nebulous existential dread anymore. It is a very clear problem that connects me to other people, I think, is the other thing that I've found is deeply, deeply gratifying and cathartic is the discovery that when I tell my story to a group of people or I write a book and someone reads it, inevitably what has occurred, and it has been a huge surprise to me, is people coming up to me and saying, I needed to hear what you had to say today or what I read in your book because I was in a moment in my life where I felt like everything was over or that I felt like I had no options. And just witnessing you, bearing witness to you, has given me insight into my own life. And for me, I have found there's just been these endless ways of that I've learned to unpack what I've gone through that has shed light on things for myself, but also for other people. Like giving, I'll give you an example of this because this is again like this idea that something that happened in the past doesn't really live in the past. When I got pregnant and I was giving birth to my daughter, my husband was in the room, my mom was in the room, and out comes my daughter, and she's crying and in pain because she's just been birthed. And I was just stricken with the realization that I could not take away her pain for her. And the first words that I said to her as they laid her on my chest were, I'm sorry. Like I could not, if I could have, I would have taken all the pain that she was feeling and put it on myself. And then here I was in this room with my mom,
Mm.
who all the time that I had been in prison would have done the exact same thing. She would have taken my place if she could, and she couldn't. And so uh, I just have these like flashes of realization and connection as even as my life continues to unfold, where the truth, the universality of human trauma and of the possibility of connection because of trauma becomes revealed to me. And that for me has been incredibly healing.
And so useful to others, um, without any doubt. Amanda, you are, I think, as is clear from this conversation, you're so incredibly eloquent. You are, I'm in communications as a profession, and you are a really brilliant communicator. Your speeches in English and in Italian, by the way, are deeply impressive.
Yeah.
Communication, words, so important in any crisis situation, but none more so than in yours. How is it that the murder of a young woman becomes known as the Amanda Knox affair,
Hmm.
rather than the Rudy Gaudet case, or even, frankly, the
Yeah.
murder of Meredith Kercher?
Yeah.
Those words, the phrase that you've used, I think, is sort of guilt adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
The public framing of a case that ruined your life, that wrecked your life, not ruined, that wrecked your life, because you've reclaimed your life, didn't belong to you. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
how are you left feeling now about the importance of words?
I mean, it's fundamental. I think one of the I I'm eloquent today because I have been forced to be very clear and concise in my language. Uh, there's a there's a joke I'm working on. Actually, I sometimes I do stand up, and there's this joke that I'm working on about how no one is more surprised and offended by my eloquence today than me. Because where was that Oscar Wilde in, turn of phrase when I was being interrogated as a 20-year-old in a foreign country? Where was that, concise, perspective when I was on the witness stand having to defend myself? I was a deer in headlights in many ways for so long, and for so long I stumbled over myself, again, also in a foreign language, trying to explain myself and failing for so long. And part of that was because I was set up to fail by, by the criminal justice system and by the media who, before I existed, I was an anonymous person. I came into existence in the public mind in a very specific light and with a very specific role as the villain. And so everything I said and everything I did was viewed in the worst possible light. And I think ultimately was grounded on this very, very old and I call sticky idea, which is that women are incapable of true friendship because we are in sexual competition with each other. And that was the narrative that was spun by the prosecution to make sense of the fact that they were accusing a young woman of a man's crime. And because it was scandalous and eye-catching and therefore profitable, that was the narrative that was pursued and amplified in the media for so, so long. And it did not become the murder of Meredith Kercher. It did not become the wrongful conviction of Amanda Knox. When the actual murderer got out of prison, what the headlines were, Amanda Knox's roommate's killer freed from prison. And, no mention of Meredith's name, no mention of the actual killer's name, just mine. And so my identity, my face, my name becomes associated because it was the most profitable way of telling the story. And it was the most compelling way to tell the story in a courtroom. And I think one of my biggest learning moments for myself was that both of these institutions, which are presumably endowed with all of this power and all this responsibility, is because it is in the pursuit of truth, both media and the justice system. But what I discovered instead is both of these institutions are incentivized to pursue the most compelling story and not necessarily the most truthful. And as a result of that, again, one of those learning lessons from the history of this case, we as people who depend upon these institutions should ask ourselves, is that what we want? Do
Yes.
we want the most compelling story or do we want the most truthful? And if so, how do we change the incentive structures within both of these institutions so that we get what we're paying for?
How do you feel about the sort of explosion in true crime?
Hmm.
Podcasts, frankly, obviously a medium that you and I are fans of.
Yeah.
But, TV
But
shows,
everything.
books.
I mean,
There are conventions, right, that are
conventions.
focused on
I've actually
it's
just been,
true crime, tourism.
yep,
It's on
there's
another
true
level.
crime cruises that I've been made aware of very recently.
Goodness.
Yeah, so true crime is an entertainment product, right? That is a thing now. And I actually did a big series on my podcast Labyrinths about this called Blood Money, which was about the history and ethics of true crime. And I think an interesting discovery that I made is that true crime as a entertainment product has existed for as long as the printing press. It like
Sure.
in weird
Yeah.
ways, it's become
Crime's
a
always
little bit.
sold. Yep.
Yeah, well, it's crime has always sold.
Hmm.
People used to be able to pay to walk through crime scenes and observe the dead bodies. Like it used to be very, very graphic and very unethical. Um, but you're right, there has been a resurgence of interest and very open interest in true crime recently that has led to tourism and fandom, which is very interesting.
That must worry you.
Well,
Yeah.
it is worrying because what is ultimately being sold is the worst experience of someone's life to a broad audience. However, I have had to complicate my feelings about this because I think there's a knee-jerk impulse to say, obviously, this is unethical. Everyone should stop consuming true crime. But there is a purpose. There are purposes that help people. So if you were to say to a victim of a missing persons case that there shouldn't be true crime conventions anymore, they would say, then where am I going to find the people who can help me find my sister or my missing child? Like, there is so much crime that has gone unsolved or has been, in the case of wrongful convictions, solved in the wrong way. And there's only so many resources out there to address those wrongs. And yet there is this intense interest and passion that people have in solving the puzzle ultimately. Like, it's a puzzle for people that
Yes.
has life and death. It's a life and death puzzle.
Yeah.
Like
It's
that
it's a kind
people,
of real life whodunit, isn't it? It's as you say,
right.
it's entertainment.
And so, is it good? Is it bad? I think it depends on what, how it's ultimately benefiting or exploiting the people who have the most at stake.
Sure.
And so that's where it becomes complicated.
Amanda, you're a mother of two young children, as we discussed. One day you'll be explaining to them what happened to their mum.
Mm.
I don't know how you begin to approach that challenge.
Well,
You're a way away
yeah.
from having to do it, but
Well,
or not.
actually, so my 3-year-old daughter is very precocious. She loves stories, but she's also very aware of social interactions. And she has witnessed me. I don't hide from her the fact that I go to, very recently, there was the Innocence Network conference where I'm surrounded by other people who are wrongly convicted and we're all telling our stories. And because she's fascinated by stories, she asks questions like, why are we here? What's this person's story? What's that person's mom? What's your story? And I've taken the position as a mother that I owe my daughter transparency um, that is age appropriate. And so the age appropriate response to her asking questions about my story is to say, well, once upon a time, mommy was younger and she went to go live in Italy and she made friends, and then somebody hurt her friend. And the police thought that mommy hurt her friend. And so they put mommy in jail. And mommy stayed there and was sad for a long time until she could prove that she didn't hurt her friend. And then she got to go home. And then she married Papa and she had you. The end. And she loves that story. Honestly, like again one of those amazing consequences of sharing your story is the how someone responds. And my daughter responds almost like I've told her a fairy tale.
Yeah,
And she'll want to play pretend when mommy goes to Italy. So
gosh,
when we go to like the park, if there's like bars somewhere, she'll get behind the bars and be like, look, I'm mommy, let me out.
oh my goodness.
And which, like, it's both like so sad and also so funny. Like the lightness with which she can play mommy goes to Italy, that really puts it into perspective for me that that it's it doesn't have to be all tragedy all the time.
But what sits at the centre of that is that transparency has to be
Yeah.
the approach that you take.
Yep. Age appropriate transparency.
Well, look, I think what will become clear, dare I say it, for your daughters as they get older, is just how an astonishingly resilient mother that they have. Thank you for your time today, Amanda, and for your wisdom. I think
Well,
what you've
thank
had.
you for this lovely conversation.
No,
I
so
really
I
appreciate it.
think what you've had to say here, and the honesty with which you've said it, sort of reinforces the point that we started with. Really, the sort of universal value of telling your story. Amanda Knox, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, then please do leave us a review, and if you found it helpful or even inspiring, we would be delighted if you recommended us to your friends. It means an awful lot if you do. You can watch the full episodes on YouTube, follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and if you hit subscribe, you'll find a lot more crisis conversations. As always, full transcripts are available on our website, along with links. Just head to crisiswhatcrisis.com, and thank you so much for listening.